Shalom, this is Shira Sherbow, and welcome to our Torah for the Nations weekly meeting. We're getting a little late start tonight, but I don't know, Shabbat keeps going out later and later, and we're just rushing around here. But welcome to our weekly meeting, and we're coming to you from Spot, Israel. And tonight we're going to learn the real story of what's going on with Ruth and Boaz. It's a great story, so buckle your seatbelts. I'm getting all of this from Rabbi David Foreman, and he has the website called Aleph Beta, and he's one of my favorite teachers. But it just so happens today that I was with a friend, and her husband is a Torah teacher, and he wrote this, and I'm going to read it to you because it's just amazing to me how what he wrote goes so much with what I was preparing to talk to you about tonight. Has to do with what's going on in the world right now with all of the death going on. And of course we know there's death that happens in the story of Ruth. So, okay, let me just read to you what he says. He says, how is it that, this is from Shia Gutman. How is it that we get it so wrong? Once we finally become aware of our own mortality, which happens more often when we find people we love dying around us, we face the demoralizing fact that after we're gone, we're soon forgotten. Our natural desire is to leave something lasting. We want to be remembered by future generations. We want to feel like we contributed something, otherwise life seems meaningless. But the reason we feel this way is because we have been living with the wrong perspective all along. We keep measuring our impact on this world, forgetting that it is this world that is the temporary one. The problem is not that what we're doing is forgettable, it's that we're trying to make a lasting impression on a temporary world. It's as if we were trying to draw a masterpiece on a fogged up window. Did you ever try to draw on a windshield when it's all foggy, and then what happens? He said, it doesn't matter how brilliant the drawing is, when the condensation evaporates, the drawing's gone. So he says, once we leave this world and enter the next, we'll never look back. The purpose of this world will have been accomplished to get us to the next. When we get there, we will realize that, and the only regrets we will have will be that we didn't use it enough for that purpose. Instead, we were largely preoccupied with building structures that wouldn't last in a world. And building structures that would last in a world that would not. Okay, so he's talking about this idea of a memory. When someone dies, what lives on after them? And so that is so much of what's going on in the story of Ruth. Okay, so what is this book about? Rabbi Foreman, he starts out and he says, what other famous person in the Torah does Ruth compare to? And so he gives us some clues. He says, Boaz describes Ruth, he describes her kindness. So Ruth is known for her kindness. So think about who else in our Torah is known for kindness. And he uses the same language. You left behind, when Boaz is speaking to Ruth, you left behind your father and your mother, your birthplace. Who else left behind their mother and their father? Who else left behind their birthplace? Who else went to a land that they didn't know? The answer, we all know what God says to Abraham. Go forth from your land, from your father's land, from your birthplace, to the land that you do not know, to the land that I will show you. So we see that the language of Ruth is patterned after Abraham. And he says that it's almost as if Ruth is a latter-day Abraham. So if we want to understand what's really going on in the story of Ruth, we have to look at what's going on in the story of Abraham. So God makes a promise to Abraham, and he says, Abraham at the very beginning of the nation heard the word of God coming to him and saying, I will multiply your children greatly. I will make them into nations, and kings will come from you. So the promise to Abraham is not just that he's going to have a lot of children, but those children will coalesce into a nation, and that nation is going to be organized politically by virtue of kings. Kings will come from you, he says. So, when does this finally become realized? When is this promise fulfilled? Well, the era of kings is ushered in by King David. And who does King David come from? That's the book of Ruth. So the book of Ruth is like a culmination of this promise given 10 generations earlier to Abraham. All right. So our mission statement is first defined by this narrative of Abraham, the story of the birth of a nation. It says it becomes codified at the giving of the Torah at Sinai into a set of rules and stories that embodies these rules. So that's what the Torah is. Laws and stories, laws and stories. Okay. So the book of Ruth, the story of Ruth, is a culmination of the mission statement. And this is reached when we get the Torah, we see the echoes of Abraham and Ruth. Okay, so there are 6 little verses at the end of the story of Noah that we just, if we want to know who Abraham is, we look at these 6 verses, and it's so easy just to skip over them because they're kind of confusing. But he says that's the key to understanding who Abraham is and understanding the story of Ruth. So we look at the end of Parsha Noah, and we look at the last 6 verses. And what we have is a father with 3 sons. The father's name is Terah. Let's see, his name is, did I say that right? Terach. Terach has 3 sons. Terah in English, Terach in Hebrew. Okay, he has Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And one of the sons dies. Haran dies. So then it says that Haran had a son named Lot. And then we find out he also had 2 daughters. So there's a father with 3 sons. One of the sons dies and leaves 3 orphans, a boy and 2 girls. And it turns out that Abraham, the 2 living brothers, marry the 2 girls. So there's this idea of, it's called yibum. And it's an idea that when someone dies, they don't want their name to be forgotten. They don't want their name to be blotted out. And so it's like, what can we do to keep that person alive, to perpetuate their legacy, to perpetuate their name? And so that's what's going on. And to really realize what is happening here, it's just a little story of a father with 3 sons, 1 son dies, and then it shows how the other 2 brothers kind of come into action, and they do this great kindness for their dead brother. They're going to have children with they marry his children so that he kind of is going to live on through their children. And to really understand that story, you have to understand the story that goes on right before that. And the story that goes on right before that is the story of the Tower of Babel. And the people in the story of the Tower of Babel are worried about building a name for themselves. So it's a very narcissistic world that Abraham and his family live in. And you see this great contrast of this little family that's trying to keep the name of their dead brother alive, and they're worried about him and his legacy, in contrast with everyone else in the world that's united because, what do they say? They realize that they're going to die, and they say, let's make a name for ourselves. We'll build a monument to ourselves. Okay? And he says, what is the folly of the tower builders? And it's like what I was reading earlier. We'll build a monument to ourselves. The irony of building a name is that you can't build it by focusing on it. Building a name is a byproduct of doing worthwhile things, good things for others, taking care of others. It's not something that happens by focusing on name building. Indeed, when you focus overtly on building your own name, on building monuments to yourself, your life is essentially empty. There's nothing there. Life as a tower builder is devoid of meaning, and it's a monument to nothing. Okay? So we have this great contrast between the narcissism in the world, let's build a tower for ourselves, and then this selfless love that this little family does. So, God is wanting to find someone in the world. He says, God, in creating mankind, has sought out a relationship with all of mankind. And, okay, it says it was possible in the days of Adam, it was possible in the days of Noah, but after the tower, it's no longer possible because humanity has fragmented into different peoples with different cultures and different languages. So God, he takes this one family and he begins to develop a relationship and then work outwards. And so the Tower of Babel created this need for Abraham. How is God's name ever going to be made known in the world when everyone is concerned about their own name? Building this tower, building a monument to themselves. So God is like, who do I have to work with? And so these 6 little verses at the end of the Parshat Noah tell us who Abraham is and why God chose him. I think that light's flashing, okay. So Rabbi Foreman says, Abraham had defined a dream to dedicate his own creative ability to have a child to the legacy of someone else. And God said, maybe you can be the one to perpetuate my legacy in the world. He said, Abraham built altars. Abraham walked the promised land and he built altars, and he built altars of stone, in contrast to the tower that was built of bricks. Bricks are man-made monuments to themselves. The altars made out of stone was made out of God material. And the altars were to God. So, and as Abraham builds his second altar, he says, he calls out in the name of God. It's about the name of God, not my name. As Abraham builds these altars, where does he live? He lives in a tent. His habitation is temporary. And the altars for God, they are forever. So this is why Abraham just stands out in a crowd. He is chosen to be the one to start this family. Okay? And so then we look at the story that's going on right before the Tower of Babel. And that is also the story about a man with 3 sons. It's the story of Noah. And Noah has Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And one of the sons doesn't die, Ham, but it's as if he died because he is cursed by Noah and his whole legacy is destroyed. So the story goes that Noah became drunk after the flood. Ham invades his private chambers and sees his nakedness. When Noah wakes up from his drunken sleep, he realizes what happened and he curses Ham's child with the curse of slavery. So this is a tragedy, and the 2 other brothers act. What do? They take a cloak, they place it on their shoulders, and they walk backwards, and they cover the nakedness of their father, and they restore his dignity. So there's a little bit of commonness in these stories, but there's a very big difference. Each one is a father with 3 sons. In one, the son Haran dies, and in the story of Noah, his son Ham It's like he's dead. So it says that Shem and Japheth, they act to preserve the dignity of their father, but they don't really do anything for their brother. In contrast to that, 10 generations later, when we have the story of Abraham and his brother, they act to restore their brother's name. Okay. So, and when you go back, even before the story of Noah, we get to the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And who is killed in that story? Abel. And you've got Cain going, what, am I my brother's keeper? So you don't see any brotherly love there. And later on, we see that Adam and Eve, they say they have another son. They have Seth. And they say, because after the death of Abel, Adam and Eve have a third child, and his name is Seth. Because God has established other seeds for me, other children for me in place of Abel, because Cain had killed him. Seth is the spiritual continuance of Abel, and he keeps Abel's name alive throughout the generations. And so this is the very first time that this idea of yibum, of keeping the dead person's name alive, is in the Torah. But it's nothing that the brother does for the brother. It's something that the parents do for the child. Then you get to the story of Noah, and it's something that the children do for the parents. So you've got the parents helping the child, you've got the children helping the parents, but you don't have any brothers helping brothers until you get 20 generations in to the Abraham story, and then you have brothers helping brothers. Okay, so now we go and we see what happens 10 generations after Abraham. It's going to take us to the Ruth story. It says, Abraham gives birth to Isaac, that's one, who gives birth to Jacob, who gives birth to Judah, who gives birth to Peretz, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, and then Boaz. So we see that there's this pattern going from Adam and Eve to Noah to Abraham and now to the Ruth story. Ruth's story is like 30 generations in the making. So what happens in the Ruth story? Here we go again. We have a man with the two sons. Elimelech has his wife and his two sons. And Elimelech dies. And the two sons, they spring into action. On the one hand, they get married. But who do they marry? They marry Moabite women. So they're not thinking about carrying on their father's name. They marry outside of the family. And what we find out is that Elimelech was very wealthy. And what he did when he left Bethlehem during the famine, it was the exact opposite of kindness, because the people were starving, the people were looking to him. He was a leader, and he left. He just bailed. He didn't want all these poor, hungry people coming to him, so he took his family and he left. And so it was like a spiritual death, Abraham's dream of kindness and everything. It just seems to come to a complete halt. There's no kindness. He leaves, the leader leaves. He dies, so it's a spiritual death and a physical death. Then his two sons, they marry, but they marry outside the family, so they're not worrying about keeping his name going. So he says there's 3 men, there's a tragedy, one dies, the 2 remaining spring into action, they take wives externally, everything is the same, but internally it's all the reverse. The soul of this story is the destruction of kindness within a family. Soon the 2 sons also die. And now what's going to happen? What will be the legacy of Elimelech and the 2 brothers who've died in the fields of Moab without any children? So this is the lowest of the lowest point. It's not supposed to happen this day. You think, this way. It was like every 10 generations it was getting better and better. And now what happened? And so it says, Cain was apathetic, but 10 generations later, Shem and Japheth acted. They tried to help. 10 generations after that, Abraham and Nahor helped their brothers, but 10 generations later, it's a disaster. Elimelech abandons the needs of his countrymen, and his children abandon his needs. And a family of leaders is headed for oblivion. Okay, it's looking really bad. So all we have left now is the widow, Naomi, and the 2 daughter-in-laws. And she has a heart-to-heart talk with them. And she tells them that this idea of yibum, this idea of perpetuating the memory of my husband, of your husbands, it's not really going to work. She says, I don't have any other children. There's no other children that you can marry. Even if I had a child now, by the time they got old enough, you would be too old. Give up the quest. It's not going to happen. So Orpah gives up, but Ruth, she's like Abraham. She goes on. Okay, so we look back over all these stories and we think, what was the Tower of Babel all about? It's about caring about your own private legacy, disregarding the legacy of those who loved you, of those who you love. Okay, and that's the story of these 2, their names are Machlon and Kilion, the two sons that died. Just as the tower crumbled, they wither away as well. So the only hope for the preservation of the family is with someone who's outside the family, even outside the nation. And this is Ruth. And so she embarks on this impossible quest, he says. So Ruth comes back with her mother-in-law to the land of Israel, and miraculously she ends up in this field of Boaz. And Boaz, he speaks of Elimelech and Machlon, and he says, our brother, he calls him his brother. They're really cousins. So there starts to be this possibility of this idea of keeping the dead brother's name alive. And Boaz starts to recognize Ruth's kindness. He's impressed with her, and he tells her that. And he says to her, it was told to me everything you've done to your mother-in-law after your husband died, how you left your father and your mother behind, and you came to this land, and may God reward you for your action. And he says, let him shelter you beneath his wings. He says those words. Very poetic, but he doesn't do anything. So her mother-in-law tells her what to do. And she goes and she lays by him in the middle of the night. And she's basically saying, marry me. It's not just about me. It's about your brother, my dead husband. And she uses the words, she says, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Spread your wings over your maidservant. So she uses his words, because you are a redeemer. Spread your wings over me. So Boaz had used that kind of metaphor. He says, let God shelter you beneath his wings. And she was like, if I'm worthy of having God spread his wings over me, then God, you think that God should spread his wings over me, then maybe you should too. And so that's what happens. Boaz implicitly accepts her demand and sends her back to her mother-in-law with a strange sign, a cloth filled with 6 seeds of barley. So this is really interesting. He says, bring me that cloth that you're wearing. Grab hold of it. And she grabs hold of it, and she puts 6 barley seeds in it. And he placed it on her. So this word means he placed it upon her, he established it upon her, and it's the same word that's used that Adam and Eve said for when they had their son Seth. And then he says, grab the cloth the cloth that and walk back towards your mother-in-law. So we've heard this before too, when Shem and Japheth grabbed a cloth and walked toward their parent. And so now it's just reliving all of this. He says he will give her a cloth with seed in it, to walk back toward her parent. This time the cloth is not just to help father. The cloth has seeds. So there's a message here. There will be the birth of new life. A legacy will be carried on. There will be a child. The child of Boaz and Ruth is Obed. Obed gives birth to Jesse, and Jesse gives birth to David. And David is the birth of kings within the Jewish people. So now we find out that Ruth comes from Moab, and Moab comes from Lot, and Lot is Haran's son, right? And so that was Abraham's dead brother. So everything finally comes full circle. He says, centuries before, Abraham had acted selflessly to perpetuate the name of his dead brother Haran. And now Haran's child would do the same for Abraham's family when it found itself in crisis. Oh, this is just amazing to me. Centuries later, when kindness had died within Abraham's family, within the line that was inextricably moving towards kingship, when there was no more hope, when Elimelech's family had reached a dead end, someone, a child of Haran, would not give up, would selflessly dedicate herself to the needs of Abraham's family. Ruth would breathe new life back into that family. Haran's child would save Abraham's child to bring about kingship within Abraham's people. Okay, so it says the story of Ruth has a plot. It's about a quest, Ruth's quest to perpetuate a name. So at the end of the day, the holiday of Shavuot tells us about our mission statement. On this holiday, we read the Ten Commandments. It's an embodiment of this mission statement in the realm of law, but we also read the book of Ruth, an embodiment of the mission statement, not in law, but in story. The mission tells us one thing for sure. For all we do is reassure ourselves, if all we do is reassure ourselves about how special we are, about how much we think God loves us, we really would just become tower builders. But our mission demands a selflessness, a focus on perpetuating the name of others, whether God or people, even at the expense of our own legacy. It is why Abraham mattered, why Ruth mattered, and why each of us in our own lives can still matter today. So, I mean, I just couldn't say it better than him. That's why I read most of it. It's just an amazing story. I never really connected Ruth back to Abraham, and the whole story that repeated itself with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and then Noah and his sons, and then Terach and his 3 sons, and 10 generations, 10 generations, 10 generations till we get to the story of Ruth and Boaz, and how they're still working in this kindness to perpetuate, selflessness, thinking of others, and that's really what the Torah is all about, and it culminates itself in that story. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you all have a good week, and we will be in the Zoom room here, and just look on this is the same link. It's going to be the same one every time, and so we'll see you in about a half hour. Bye for now. Shalom from Israel.